Rain had not touched the town of Brookhaven in over a week. The skies were a dry stretch of navy velvet by the time graduation night arrived. At Brookhaven High, the gymnasium echoed with the raucous celebration of proud students and tearful parents. Folding chairs scraped across polished floors. Cameras flashed, and outside 6 seniors quietly slipped out into the shadows. Their names would later be remembered with a certain haunted reverence, but on that night they were just teenagers looking for a private moment to seal their friendship. They laughed as they piled into an old Jeep Wrangler owned by the class valedictorian Cassidy Monroe. Her red gown was wrinkled in the back, her honor cords trailing like lost ribbons as the wind caught them. In the passenger seat, Marcus Hill shouted a joke loud enough to startle a dog from across the street. Behind them, no one noticed the door to the gym slowly close, as if sealing a chapter that would never reopen. The Jeep rolled through Brookhaven's narrow streets past the bakery that never reopened after the fire past the boarded-up theater where teenagers used to sneak in for midnight showings. The town felt like a photograph someone had forgotten to update its edges, fraying under the weight of nostalgia. But for the 6 friends in the car, it was a night thick with promise. They were going to the cliffs. Everyone who graduated from Brookhaven knew the cliffs. It was tradition. Watch the sunrise from the overlook. Carve initials into the wooden railing. Talk about the future like it was a country they were all about to explore together. Cassidy, Marcus, Jordan, Lexi, Theo, and Anna. Their names still appear in yearbooks. Still hang in frames near the front office. Still get whispered in the hallways when no teachers are around. That night, they never made it to the cliffs. By morning, the Jeep was found parked neatly on the shoulder of a county road, 18 keys in the ignition. Its interior eerily undisturbed. No signs of a struggle, no footprints leading away, no blood. Just a subtle scratch on the dashboard barely noticeable where someone had etched the number 7. That detail would go unnoticed for nearly 14 years. The police arrived within the hour. Parents called every friend. The school sent out a robocall that turned into a local legend for how unsettling it sounded. Search parties combed the woods, helicopters buzzed overhead, and the town held candlelight vigils that drew national media for a brief, frenzied window. Then, just as quickly, the world moved on. The town returned to its quiet decay. And the 6 students remained missing, frozen in time, their senior portraits locked behind the dusty glass of the school's main hallway. 14 years passed like a whispered promise. Teachers retired. Families moved. The story of the vanishing became the kind of local myth passed between younger students during sleepovers and campfire nights. They speculated about cults, about hidden tunnels beneath the school, about a substitute teacher no one remembered hiring. But real answers never came. The files grew cold, until one spring morning when the school was undergoing renovations and the earth in the courtyard was broken open. Workers were digging to make room for a new memorial garden. One shovel struck something hard. A metallic thunk echoed in the crisp air. When they unearthed the object, it was a rusted metal box sealed tightly. Inside, wrapped in plastic and bound with yellowing tape, was a single item that would reignite every old fear, every buried rumor, and every desperate hope. It was a yearbook, but not just any yearbook. It was from 2009, 1 year after the 6 students had disappeared. The cover was pristine, untouched by the soil that should have eroded it to dust. And when the principal opened the book, he nearly dropped it. There, among the graduating class portraits, were 6 faces that had no right to be there. Cassidy, Marcus, Jordan, Lexi, Theo, Anna. Each photo different from their senior year shots. Each looking slightly older. Each smiling as if nothing had ever happened. And at the bottom of the page, in a hand-scrawled caption no one recognized, were the words, "We made it after all." The school was locked down. The district called in the sheriff. The yearbook was sent for forensic analysis, but the initial sweep found nothing. No fingerprints, no tampering. The ink matched that of regular printers from 2009. Yet, no such yearbook had ever been printed, and no student remembered posing for those photos. The town buzzed with theories, some rational, some unthinkable. Parents who had moved away came back, driven by a mixture of dread and wild hope. But most people didn't notice the other detail. the one the janitor spotted while sweeping the courtyard the next morning. Etched into the back of the metal box, almost too faint to read, was a second message, one no one could explain, one that chilled everyone who saw it. It read, "Do not dig again." The message was first dismissed as a hoax, a joke etched by some student long after the disappearance. But Principal Harland knew better. He had been at Brookhaven High when the 6 went missing. He had read the robocall script himself. He had sat beside parents who collapsed with grief in the front office. When he saw the words, "Do not dig again," etched into the back of the box, he felt something shift inside him. Not fear, exactly, but a heaviness, a pressure behind the eyes that made the air feel thinner. He instructed the workers to halt all courtyard renovations. No explanation was given to the students. Just a bright orange safety fence encircling the exposed earth and a vague announcement about soil instability. But the yearbook had already stirred something. Rumors trickled out. A photo taken by a janitor leaked to a local blog. By the following Monday, whispers had spread from the front lockers to the back bleachers. Students were daring each other to sneak into the courtyard after dark. Everyone wanted to see the spot where the ground gave up secrets. Among those students was Quinn Lawson. At 17, Quinn was known for her silence more than anything else, a senior with sharp eyes and quiet footsteps. She had grown up in Brookhaven, but few knew her family had been close to Cassidy Monroe. Quinn had once found an old shoebox in her attic filled with birthday cards addressed to Cassidy in her mother's careful handwriting. Quinn never asked about it. She never needed to. She had memorized every article about the vanishing long before the new yearbook was found. She knew the Jeep had been parked facing west. She knew Jordan had been wearing a navy bow tie. She knew the last text sent from Marcus Hill's phone simply said, "Almost there." And when she heard about the message on the back of the box, something inside her snapped into focus. That night, she snuck onto campus with a flashlight and a notebook. She waited until the security lights flickered into their idle cycle, then climbed the side fence, landing softly near the science wing. She approached the courtyard with deliberate steps, scanning the ground for anything that had been overlooked. The soil was still torn and uneven. The workers had covered it with a tarp weighed down by bricks, but it fluttered slightly in the breeze. Quinn knelt and slipped a hand beneath the edge. What she found was not just dirt, it was ash, a fine layer of charred particles that clung to her fingers. She rubbed them together, then wiped her hand on her jeans. She reached into her backpack and retrieved a plastic vial, scooping a sample before sealing it tightly. She did not believe in ghosts or time travel or cursed yearbooks, but she believed in patterns. She believed in things buried to be forgotten. As she stood to leave, something snagged her attention. A rusted nail jutted from a broken brick, its surface smeared with red. Not paint, not rust, blood, dried and flaking. She bent closer, and beneath the nail she saw something far more disturbing. A patch of fabric. Blue. Faded. And unmistakably stitched with the name Theo. The next morning, Quinn skipped first period and walked straight to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Camden, now older and slower but still wearing the same brown uniform from the original investigation, listened patiently as she recounted what she had found. He nodded, asked questions, took notes. But when she showed him the bloodied fabric, his face changed. He took the sample from her gently and stepped into the back office. He returned 5 minutes later with a look that told her more than words ever could. She asked if they would reopen the case. He said the case had never really been closed. He told her that last year someone had broken into the evidence locker. They had only taken one thing, a watch. It had belonged to Cassidy. No one had been caught. No cameras had picked up a suspect. And most curiously of all, the security footage from that night was missing precisely 4 minutes of data. Quinn asked if that seemed like a coincidence. Sheriff Camden stared at her for a long time before answering. He told her that coincidence had stopped explaining things in Brookhaven a long time ago. Later that week, a storm rolled in. Heavy winds forced the cancellation of afternoon classes. The safety tarp in the courtyard tore free and flapped wildly against the construction fence. The janitor, Mr. Holloway, went to secure it. When he did not return, the front office radioed him twice. No answer. 30 minutes later, a teacher found him slumped on the brick path, his eyes wide and unblinking. He was alive, but unresponsive. Paramedics arrived and carried him away on a stretcher. Students gathered at the windows, whispering theories. Some said he saw something that made his mind break. Others said he heard a sound no one else could. By the next day, the courtyard was sealed off with plywood boards, and police tape stretched across every entrance. But the damage was done. Whatever had been silent for 14 years was no longer sleeping. The morning after the storm, Brookhaven High felt different. The air was thicker somehow, like the silence between sentences stretched too long. Students avoided the courtyard windows. Teachers whispered behind closed doors. And the plywood barrier now erected where the garden was meant to grow had become a symbol of everything the town wanted to ignore. But Quinn could not ignore it. She sat in the back of her journalism class, her notebook open but untouched. Her eyes were fixed on the window pane, watching as condensation formed slow trails down the glass. Her fingers itched for answers. She had not slept much. The fabric with Theo's name still haunted her, folded in a Ziploc bag under her mattress. It smelled faintly of earth and smoke. She thought of the ash, the blood, the etched warning. Her pen finally scratched across paper. She wrote down a single word: surveillance. At lunch, Quinn approached the tech teacher, Mr. Delgado, a man with thick glasses and a voice like sandpaper. She asked him if the school kept any footage from before the renovation started. He seemed puzzled at first, then thoughtful. He told her most files were auto-erased every 3 months. But he remembered something. There had been an old maintenance camera fixed on the courtyard, mounted high on a weathered light post. It was an analog, disconnected from the main school network. No one had bothered removing it when digital systems took over. It recorded onto microtapes. He believed the tapes were stored in the AV room's back cabinet, the one labeled obsolete. Quinn thanked him and made her way down the hallway, heart pounding with every step. The AV room was seldom used, now a dust-lined capsule of outdated projectors and wheeled carts. She closed the door behind her and turned on the overhead light. The cabinet stood in the corner like an old sentinel, its metal face rusted at the edges. Inside the cabinet were stacks of unlabeled boxes. She opened one. Tapes. Dozens of them. Quinn scanned the dates written in faded marker until her fingers stopped on a label that read June 7th. That was the day before the 6 disappeared. She pulled it from the box and slotted it into the nearby player, praying the machine still worked. It whirred to life with a mechanical hum, and the monitor flickered with static before forming a grainy black and white image of the courtyard. The timestamp confirmed it. The night before graduation. The camera caught little more than shifting trees and a swinging lamppost. But then around 2 in the morning, movement. A figure entered from the east wing door, a teenager. Quinn leaned closer. The image was distorted, but she could make out a Letterman jacket. Probably Marcus or Jordan. The figure knelt near the center of the courtyard. Dug something. Quinn's stomach tightened. The figure placed a box into the earth. Not the same one that had been unearthed recently. This one was smaller. Rectangular. The video cut off with a flicker. The tape ended. Quinn rewound it and watched again. She froze the screen just as the figure turned briefly toward the camera. Her breath caught. The face was partially obscured, but something about it felt off. Wrong. The eyes reflected the light in a way that did not look natural, as if the camera had captured something not meant to be seen. She ejected the tape, slid it into her backpack, and hurried out of the AV room. She needed help. Not from the school, not from the sheriff, from someone who would understand the patterns. She sent a message to her cousin Seth, a former student who had graduated 2 years before the vanishing. Seth had been obsessed with the case. He had even built a digital archive of every article, theory, and report. He called it the Vanish Ledger. Most people forgot about it, but Quinn had bookmarked it years ago. Seth replied within minutes. he was still in town, still watching. She met him that evening in the parking lot of the old library, where they used to trade books under flickering street lamps. He was taller than she remembered, leaner, eyes sharper. She handed him the tape and recounted what she saw. He listened in silence, then nodded slowly. He told her that months after the disappearance, a janitor had filed a strange report. He claimed he found a rectangle of fresh dirt near the east wing door, as if something had been recently buried. The report was ignored, but Seth had logged it in the ledger. Now it made sense. They both agreed to go back. That night. The school was dark when they arrived, but Quinn had memorized the guard patterns. They slipped through a gap in the side gate, sticking to the tree line until they reached the courtyard. The plywood barrier creaked in the wind. Seth carried a handheld metal detector. Quinn held the flashlight. They searched near the east wing door. Minutes passed. Then a beep. Faint but clear. They dug with gloved hands until they struck something hard. A box. Smaller than the yearbook container. Lighter. They pried it open. Inside was a tape recorder and a single cassette labeled 7. Seth pocketed it. They buried the box again and slipped away unnoticed. They waited until they were back at Seth's garage before opening the cassette recorder. The space was cluttered with old monitors, dusty keyboards, and dozens of stacked boxes filled with files labeled by year and case code. Seth had turned it into a makeshift archive, a personal sanctuary built from obsession and unanswered questions. Quinn sat on a stool while Seth rummaged through a drawer for fresh batteries. When the recorder finally clicked to life, they exchanged a glance, the air between them thick with tension. Seth pressed play, and a low hum filled the room. The first few seconds were nothing but static. Then slowly, a voice emerged. It was male, young, uncertain. The first words were a whisper, barely audible. He said he was alone. He said they told him to bury the box before the sun rose. Then he mentioned names. Cassidy, Lexi, Marcus. He repeated them like a mantra, as if afraid to forget. The voice grew more erratic. The speaker described a room beneath the school, a place not marked on any blueprint. He said the room was always cold even in the summer. He said the walls had carvings, not graffiti, symbols. Circles inside circles. He called them doors. He claimed that on the night of graduation they all went there together. He said they felt compelled, not forced, drawn. He described the sensation like a string pulling from behind his heart. When they entered the room, they found mirrors. Not normal mirrors. These were tall and dark like slabs of obsidian. He said the reflections did not follow movement. They lagged or blinked when no one did. The voice trembled as he recounted the moment they all stood in front of the glass. He said that was the last thing he remembered clearly. Then came screams, then silence. And then he was outside again alone with the box in his hands and blood on his shoes. Quinn felt her skin tighten as the tape continued. The boy, if it was one of the 6, never identified himself, but there was a familiarity in his tone. It felt like a confession recorded in desperation. The last 10 seconds of the tape were filled with soft weeping. Then, just before the end, the voice said something else. Something that made Seth stop the recorder instantly. He rewound and played it again. The boy said, "If you hear this and see the yearbook, it means they let us go because they want another." Seth leaned back in his chair, the color drained from his face. Quinn stared at the recorder. The tape had been buried for 14 years. Its warning had gone unheard. Until now. They sat in silence for a long time. Eventually, Seth stood and walked to the far end of the garage. He opened a cabinet and pulled out a folded map of the school grounds. He flattened it on the table, pointing to the courtyard. Then he traced a line toward the auditorium. According to legend, that was where the original school basement had been built long before the modern structure was added. Records were vague, blueprints incomplete. But Seth remembered hearing about strange acoustics in the auditorium stage, sounds that bounced oddly, lights that flickered during performances. They both knew what the next step was. They needed to get underneath the school. and they needed to do it soon. The following evening, Quinn convinced her friend Maya, a stage tech volunteer, to let them into the auditorium after hours. Maya was reluctant but agreed, after Quinn swore it was for a senior film project. With a forged work order and a borrowed key, they slipped in through the back door. The auditorium was empty and dark, the seats forming rows of quiet watchers as they crossed the stage. Seth examined the trapdoor behind the curtain, a square section of wood outlined by steel brackets. He lifted it. Beneath a ladder descended into a crawlspace thick with dust and the smell of rusted metal. Quinn went first, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Seth followed the ladder, creaking beneath his weight. The space beneath the stage was larger than expected. It extended into a low hallway lined with concrete. Pipes snaked across the ceiling. At the far end, a rusted door waited. Seth tried the handle. It gave way with a groan, opening into a chamber that made both of them freeze. The room was circular, its walls lined with strange symbols carved deep into the concrete. In the center stood 3 black mirrors taller than a person, their surfaces too dark to reflect. The air was cold, unnaturally so. Quinn stepped closer, drawn despite herself. The mirrors pulsed faintly, like something beneath the surface was shifting. Seth warned her to stop, but she reached out and placed her hand on the glass. It was warm. Quinn could not look away. Her hand pressed flat against the surface of the black mirror, and for a moment nothing happened. Then the glass seemed to ripple beneath her palm as if it were water trapped in a vertical lake. The warmth she felt turned into a gentle vibration. She pulled her hand back, but the mirror continued to shimmer faintly. Seth stepped forward cautiously, his flashlight beam quivering slightly. He moved beside her and examined the symbols on the floor around the base of the mirrors. The carvings were shallow but precise, looping into unfamiliar shapes that seemed to hum under the light. Seth took out his phone and tried to take a picture, but the screen glitched, displaying only static when aimed at the mirror. He tried again. Nothing. The reflection remained unchanged, yet he noticed something deeply wrong. Quinn was not visible in the mirror at all. He lowered his phone slowly. He looked toward Quinn, who was now standing off to the side, staring at her own reflection in the second mirror. But her image still did not appear. Only the empty chamber was reflected, with no trace of either of them. Seth moved in front of the third mirror. For a moment, he saw only the room again. Then a flicker. A shape moved behind him, something tall and indistinct. He spun around. Nothing. Just the circular chamber and its carved silence. He turned back to the mirror and saw it again. The shape was there, still, closer. Not quite human in form, not quite solid either. Seth staggered backward, his breath catching in his throat. Quinn stepped in front of the first mirror again as if compelled. She whispered something. Neither of them understood a word that came to her like a dream. Suddenly, the air inside the chamber shifted. The mirrors grew darker, deeper. A low vibration rose from the ground, barely audible but felt in their bones. The symbols on the floor began to glow faintly, like embers long buried. Seth grabbed Quinn's wrist, pulling her away from the mirror. She resisted for a second before following. They rushed back down the narrow hallway, up the ladder, and into the auditorium. When they slammed the trapdoor shut, the temperature seemed to rise instantly. The air felt normal again, but their hearts still raced. Quinn wiped her hands on her jeans and looked at Seth. He nodded slowly. They both knew they had touched something ancient, and it had noticed. The following day, Quinn returned to school trying to act as though nothing had changed, but she noticed things. Her reflection in the bathroom mirror lagged behind her movements. Not always, but often enough to unsettle her. Shadows flickered in places they should not be. She felt watched in empty hallways. During lunch, she overheard a conversation near the library. A freshman claimed to have seen Anna Fletcher's face in the window of the old music room, even though everyone knew it had been locked for years. The rumor spread quickly. The music room, once used for choir practice, was sealed after mold was found in the ceiling tiles. But the glass remained intact, dusty, yet untouched. That afternoon, Quinn went there. Alone. She stood before the window and waited. The hallway was silent except for the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. The window was coated in grime. She lifted her sleeve and wiped a circle clean. On the other side, the room was dim. She saw nothing at first. Then, in the far corner movement, a flicker. She leaned closer. A girl stood in the corner. Her back was turned. She wore a faded graduation gown. Quinn's breath fogged the glass. The figure turned. It was Anna. Her face was blank, her eyes hollow, and then she smiled. The lights above Quinn flickered violently. She stepped back. The hallway remained empty. She turned and walked quickly away. Quinn told Seth what she had seen. He did not question her. Instead, he pulled up a file on his laptop from the vanished ledger. It was an article about the music room. According to the janitor's log from 2009, the day after graduation, the room was found unlocked and freezing cold. A dead bird lay on the piano. No windows were broken. The school had dismissed it as a ventilation issue and sealed the room. But now it seemed to pulse with the same energy as the chamber beneath the stage. Seth believed the mirrors were not just reflections. They were gateways. Portals to a place where the missing students might still exist. But if that was true, then something had to be keeping them there. They needed proof. Seth suggested setting up a hidden camera in the auditorium near the trap door. They returned late that night with a thermal motion sensor and an infrared camera. Seth positioned it carefully in the balcony, angled directly at the stage. They left it running overnight. The following morning, they reviewed the footage. Hours of stillness passed. Then at 3:18 a.m., something moved. The trapdoor creaked open. A figure climbed out, tall, lean, wearing a gown. It moved with the jerky, unnatural precision. It walked to center stage, stood for nearly 5 minutes without moving, then turned and disappeared through the back curtain. Quinn and Seth stared at the screen, frozen. The timestamp burned in the corner of the video. The morning after reviewing the footage, Seth printed several stills from the video. He pinned them to a corkboard in his garage alongside the floor plan's news clippings and photographs of the 6 missing students. The figure emerging from the trapdoor stood among them now, a silent and unnerving addition. Quinn joined him a few minutes later, her eyes still tired from lack of sleep. She held a paper bag with 2 coffees and set one on the cluttered workbench. They sat in silence for a few minutes before Seth turned to a stack of binders and pulled out a file marked Sealed Reports. He explained that during his time researching the disappearance, he had submitted several Freedom of Information requests to the school district. Most were denied or returned heavily redacted, but one file had slipped through, possibly by mistake. It was a copy of an internal memo sent by Principal Harland 2 weeks before graduation in 2009. The subject line was marked Urgent. The message warned of repeated disturbances in the auditorium and suggested postponing all evening events. It was ignored. Quinn leaned in to read the document. She noted the tone of the memo, not panicked but wary. The principal had cited teacher complaints about odd behavior in students and unexplained disruptions in audio recordings during choir practice. He described it as a resonance, a kind of background hum that could not be traced to any equipment. Quinn asked why no one had acted on it. Seth shook his head. The administration had focused on final exams on managing graduation logistics. They did not want to delay the ceremony, especially not over strange sounds and atmospheric inconsistencies. But what caught Quinn's attention was a list of students who had access to the stage area that week. The names included 4 of the 6 missing seniors: Cassidy, Marcus, Lexi, Theo. Not just performers or volunteers. All were listed as having returned to the stage area multiple times after school hours. She reached for another binder, one filled with student records Seth had collected from yearbooks and school newsletters. She flipped to Cassidy Monroe's page. It mentioned her role as co-director of the senior performance, a short, dramatic piece staged 3 days before graduation. Jordan played a lead role. Lexi handled lights. Marcus managed sound. The entire group had been deeply involved with the auditorium in their final week. Quinn began to sketch a timeline on a dry erase board. She traced every known moment the group had been in or around the auditorium. The pattern became obvious. All their after-hours activities aligned with spikes in student complaints about odd sensations and flickering lights. Quinn pointed to one day in particular, June 4th. That was the night they had stayed late for rehearsals. The night the janitor reported a strange smell and a power surge that fried the hallway lights. Seth stood and crossed the room. He pulled down an old map he had tacked to the far wall. It was not just a floor plan of the school. It was a map of energy readings he had collected using borrowed EMF detectors from the science department. Most areas showed normal patterns, but the auditorium and surrounding halls were off the scale. He had dismissed it back then as interference from equipment. Now it felt like a warning sign. He placed a new pin on the map marking the trapdoor. Quinn added another marking the music room where she saw Anna. The lines connecting them began to form a shape. Not random, not chaotic, a design. They sat back down and turned their attention to the yearbook, the one buried in the courtyard. Seth retrieved the copy they had scanned for digital analysis. They opened to the page with the 6 missing students. Each portrait was labeled, but under closer inspection, Quinn noticed something. The font for their names was subtly different, off by just a pixel or two, almost unnoticeable. Seth ran a comparison algorithm on his laptop. The names had been embedded manually. The rest of the yearbook followed a uniform template, but these 6 entries had been inserted later, almost like placeholders. Quinn flipped the page and found something else. A section labeled Future Plans. Each missing student had a brief paragraph, but the language felt detached, like it had been written by someone else. Anna's entry mentioned a love for trees and silence. Cassidy's talked about shadows and the color of mirrors. None of it matched their known personalities. Seth scrolled through his database. He found essays written by each of the 6 from earlier school projects. He compared writing styles. The differences were stark. It became clear that someone had crafted those yearbook entries long after the disappearances. Someone who wanted to create the illusion they had moved on. But the question remained. Why bury the yearbook in the first place? Why not just destroy it? Quinn considered the possibility that the act of burial itself was part of a ritual. A sealing gesture, an offering. The yearbook was a message, not to the town, not to the parents, but to someone or something still listening. The auditorium sat empty that night, but the room did not feel still. Quinn sat in the center row with a notebook in her lap and a small audio recorder clipped to the back of a seat. Seth stood near the side curtain adjusting a second device calibrated to detect infrasound. They had returned with a plan. If the mirrors below the stage were interacting with their surroundings, then perhaps sound could reveal what light had not. Seth had explained how low-frequency vibrations often triggered unease in humans. Rumors of haunted buildings were sometimes traced to tones beneath our ability to consciously hear. He suspected that the carved room beneath the auditorium might be emitting such tones. He hoped to record them. Quinn hoped they might uncover something even stranger. She clicked her pen and marked the time. Midnight. The same hour the figure had appeared on their footage just 2 nights before. For 30 minutes, nothing unusual happened. The recorder displayed a flat waveform and the infrasound detector remained calm. Then the readings began to shift. A hum emerged so low it could not be heard but was felt in the chest. Seth motioned silently, pointing at the rising levels. The lights above the stage flickered once. The temperature dropped by several degrees. Quinn pressed her hand against the notebook to keep it from vibrating. She glanced toward the stage, expecting movement. Instead, the trapdoor opened slowly without a sound. Neither of them had touched it. Seth raised the microphone, recording every second. A sound came next. It was soft and layered like multiple voices whispering beneath water. It lasted 7 seconds before vanishing completely. Quinn's eyes remained fixed on the open trapdoor, but no figure emerged this time. The silence that followed felt like a question waiting for an answer. They left the auditorium in silence and returned to the garage. Seth uploaded the audio file and isolated the frequency. He played it through a modified speaker that converted the sound into visible waves on a monitor. The waveform was chaotic at first, then began to repeat. Quinn leaned closer. It was not random, it was structured. She watched as Seth applied pattern recognition software. The screen adjusted, revealing peaks and valleys in symmetrical intervals. Then a second pattern emerged within the first. Seth overlaid a spectrogram. The image displayed a shape that made both of them sit back. It resembled the carvings on the floor of the chamber. Not exact, but nearly. The hum they had recorded matched the design etched into the room. It was not just sound, it was instruction. Quinn whispered the thought before she realized she had spoken. The room was singing. Seth pulled up old blueprints of the auditorium. He scanned for any notes about acoustics, construction materials, anything that might explain the phenomenon. One detail stood out. The original stage had been built using wood salvaged from a decommissioned chapel in a nearby town. The records were incomplete, but the name of the chapel appeared in a footnote. St. Idris. Quinn searched the name online. The chapel had burned down in 1972 after being condemned for unsafe architecture. But before that, it had a long history as a spiritual retreat center. Some of the doctrine it followed had never been officially affiliated with any known religious order. Locals referred to the chapel as the Glass Church. Stories claimed it used reflective panels and rituals. Some even believed the mirrors were not symbolic but literal devices for reaching other places. Quinn read the line 3 times. The mirrors had been preserved. Seth stood and pulled a folder from the shelf labeled Historical Anomalies. He flipped through it and retrieved a yellowed newspaper clipping from 1974. The article described how materials from the chapel had been salvaged and repurposed in several county buildings. One of those buildings was Brookhaven High School. Quinn and Seth exchanged a long glance. It seemed the mirrors below the auditorium were not built by the school. They had been inherited. The glass had survived the fire. The carvings may have existed before the school was ever constructed. Seth speculated that someone in the school's planning committee had known. Perhaps not fully, perhaps only vaguely, but enough to hide the evidence underground. Quinn thought of the warning etched into the metal box, "Do not dig again." Maybe someone had already opened the mirrors once before. Seth replayed the audio file. This time they listened without the spectrogram. The layered voices sounded closer now, not clearer but heavier. Quinn closed her eyes and tried to isolate a single thread. One voice repeated a phrase. Not in English, not in any language she recognized, but the intonation reminded her of a chant, a ritual sound meant to unlock rather than inform. She opened her eyes and scribbled the phonetic syllables into her notebook. Seth noticed and frowned. He told her to be careful. He said there were too many examples in folklore where sound itself acted as a key. Some locks should remain closed. Quinn did not disagree, but she also believed they were already too close to stop. It was Saturday morning when Quinn received the letter. It arrived in a plain white envelope with no return address. The paper inside smelled faintly of smoke and dust. The message was typed in a fixed-width font, like from an old typewriter. It read simply, "You have heard the 7th. Now, find the 8th." Below the line was a single date, June 7th, the anniversary of the disappearance. Quinn stared at it for a long moment, her mind spinning with questions. She placed the letter on her desk and called Seth. He arrived within the hour, already pale from anticipation. They examined the envelope together, but found no fingerprints, no postmark. It had been hand-delivered. Someone knew what they were doing. Someone was watching them. Seth began scanning his database for any reference to an 8th student. Every official record only listed the original 6. But Quinn remembered something. A detail from the surveillance tape they had reviewed earlier. When the 6 students left the graduation party, the security camera had shown 7 silhouettes walking together. At the time, they assumed it was a trick of the light or a shadow. But what if it was not? Quinn pulled up the footage again and paused it at the moment the group exited the building. She zoomed in. The 7th figure stood slightly apart, face turned away. The shape was indistinct. Taller than Cassidy, but shorter than Marcus, Seth enhanced the contrast. The figure wore no gown, no cap, just dark clothes. Stranger among friends. A ghost in the lineup. They returned to the yearbook, scanning every page. They checked club photos, sports teams, event candid shots. Nothing. Then Seth remembered an odd entry from the AV club roster. A student named Elijah Brooke. No photo, no listed graduation status, just a name. Quinn searched the archives for enrollment records. Elijah Brooke had transferred to Brookhaven during the second semester of senior year. He had no listed classes, no locker assignment, just a digital signature on the library's computer log used 3 times in May 2009. Seth checked the school newspaper. No mention, no awards, no social media presence. It was as if he had never really existed. But someone had typed that name into the club records. Someone had tried to make it seem normal. Quinn remembered a conversation she had overheard weeks earlier. A teacher in the lounge had mentioned a student who always stayed late in the library. A quiet boy, never caused trouble, always gone before lights out. She said he had odd eyes, gray like clouded glass. Quinn wondered if that memory belonged to Elijah. She and Seth checked the library logs. The sign-in sheet from June 6, 2009 showed one name, Elijah Brooke. The timestamp was 11:46 p.m. That was less than 30 minutes before the 6 vanished. The library closed at midnight. The following day, the librarian reported a missing key. Nothing had been taken, but the east wing side door had been left ajar. That door led directly to the courtyard. Seth and Quinn began to search for external records. Birth certificates, medical files, public databases. Nothing came up under the name Elijah Brooke. But the school system still had a student ID number on file. Seth cross-referenced it with old state archives. The number was associated with another name, Elias Rook, born in 1990, died in 2004. The cause of death was listed as accidental drowning in a neighboring town. Quinn read the file twice. It was not just strange, it was impossible. If Elias Rook had died 5 years before the disappearance, how could he have transferred into Brookhaven in 2009? Seth suggested they were looking at someone who had taken the name, but Quinn felt a colder theory taking shape. What if Elias had returned? Not as a student, not as a person, but as a presence. That night they returned to the mirror chamber. They brought the phonetic chant Quinn had written from the tape and a speaker to broadcast the recorded hum. The floor cymbals lit up softly as soon as the sound began. The mirrors vibrated faintly. Quinn stepped into the center of the circle and recited the chant. The room darkened at the edges. The middle mirror rippled. A shadow appeared on the other side. This time, the figure was clearer. He wore no gown. His face was blank but not unfamiliar. Quinn felt a pulse of recognition. She whispered the name Elijah. The figure did not react. Then slowly he raised one hand and pointed to the corner of the room where a small hatch had been hidden beneath debris. They approached the hatch carefully. It opened to a narrow shaft descending into deeper darkness. Air rose from it stale and cold. Quinn turned on her flashlight and descended first. Seth followed. They found themselves in a narrow hallway made of old stone. Unlike the clean lines of the school foundation, this place felt ancient. The walls were damp. Carvings lined every surface, some familiar, others new. At the end of the hall, a room opened into a chamber shaped like an octagon. In the center stood a pedestal. Upon it sat a book, bound in dark leather. No title. Quinn approached slowly and opened the cover. The first page held a list of names. 6 of them. Cassidy Monroe, Marcus Hill, Jordan Keller, Lexi Cruz, Theo Brandt, Anna Fletcher. The 7th line was blank. The 8th line had one word. Returned. Seth closed the book gently, his fingers trembling as he stepped back from the pedestal. Quinn remained silent, her eyes locked on the 8th line. Returned. The word pulsed in her mind like a drumbeat. It suggested something final, but not in the way she expected. She turned and looked around the octagonal chamber. Each of the 8 walls bore a different symbol, some etched deep, others faint, as if drawn by a trembling hand. She walked slowly, tracing her fingers along the carvings. One symbol in particular drew her attention. It was a perfect circle interrupted by a horizontal line. The same shape they had seen on the yearbook box. She felt the air around it grow colder. When she pulled her hand away, a soft sound echoed behind her. Seth had opened a second book tucked beneath the pedestal. This one was thinner and handwritten. Its pages were filled with uneven script, mostly unreadable. But one section stood out. It was titled, "The Mirror Path." They read it together in silence. The text described a process. Not a spell or incantation, but a pattern of movement and sound. Each step required precision. Stand before the left mirror. Speak the phrase of passage. Place a token of memory on the floor, then turn to the center mirror and wait. The final instruction was simple. One goes in, one returns. Seth looked up from the page, his expression pale. He told Quinn he believed this was how the 6 had disappeared. They had entered the ritual together, but only one had emerged, Elijah or Elias or something using that name. Quinn asked why someone would return alone. Seth could not answer, but the rule was clear. Entry required sacrifice, return demanded balance. They climbed back to the mirror chamber and rechecked the mirrors. They felt different now, more active, as if aware of being seen. Quinn stood before the left one and whispered the chant again. The surface rippled faintly. Seth stepped beside her, holding out the token they had brought. It was a bracelet once worn by Cassidy, found in the evidence box Seth had borrowed from the sheriff's archives. He placed it gently on the floor. Nothing happened. Then a low hum began to resonate from the mirrors. The room darkened. The central mirror shimmered. A shape began to take form. This time, it was Cassidy. Her face was pale, but her expression was calm. She reached out and placed her hand against the glass. Quinn mirrored the gesture. Her palm pressed against the cold surface. Cassidy's mouth moved, but no sound emerged. Seth quickly turned on the recorder. The waveform displayed a faint pattern too weak to interpret. Quinn leaned in. Cassidy mouthed the same phrase 3 times. Quinn recognized the shape of the syllables. It matched the chant from the tape. Then Cassidy's image began to fade. The mirror went dark again. The bracelet on the floor was gone. Quinn and Seth stood in silence. They both understood now. The ritual could be repeated, but it came with cost. The phrase was not just a chant, it was permission. They left the school without speaking much. The next day, Quinn woke to find another envelope under her door. No markings, no stamp. Inside was a single photo. It showed the 6 students standing near the cliffs wearing their graduation gowns. But one face had been blacked out with ink. The same face appeared blurred in the original version stored on the school's website, Elijah, or the figure they believed had taken that identity. The photo felt wrong in her hands. Heaviness clung to it, as if it had been somewhere it should not have been. She called Seth. He arrived minutes later. They scanned the image and found metadata in the file embedded on the reverse. It read, "Process complete, transfer initiated." That afternoon, Principal Harland announced a sudden renovation of the auditorium. All students and staff were informed the building would be closed indefinitely due to structural concerns. The decision seemed abrupt. Seth suspected someone had seen the motion-triggered footage. Someone with authority. Quinn warned him they might be running out of time. If the school sealed the mirror chamber, they might never access it again. Seth agreed. They planned one final visit for the night of June 7th. The anniversary. The night everything started. The date in the mysterious letter. The night of June 7th arrived with still air and no moon. Clouds hung low above Brookhaven like a ceiling pressed down by unseen hands. Quinn and Seth met in the parking lot behind the gymnasium, both carrying backpacks filled with equipment and supplies. Neither spoke much. Words felt fragile now, unnecessary. Everything that needed to be said had already passed between them in glances and long silences, in the spaces between what they knew and what they feared. They moved quickly and quietly, slipping through the maintenance door near the east wing and making their way toward the auditorium. The building was darker than usual. Emergency lights had been turned off. The air inside was stale, unmoving. The trapdoor beneath the stage opened with a groan louder than either of them remembered. It echoed through the empty space like a warning. They climbed down into the mirror chamber, the flashlight beams sweeping over symbols that now felt familiar. The 3 black mirrors stood silent and still, but the floor glowed faintly as if waiting. Quinn placed the old yearbook in the center of the room. It was the same one recovered from the courtyard, the same one with the impossible portraits. She had wrapped it in cloth to keep from touching it directly. It pulsed with an odd warmth. Seth arranged 3 objects around it. The bracelet from Cassidy, a photo of Marcus with his mother torn from a newspaper clipping, and a school ID card that had belonged to Jordan. Each was a token of memory, each one a tether to what had been lost. Quinn stood before the center mirror and whispered the chant. The hum returned low and deep. The air thickened, the light dimmed, and the surface of the mirror rippled like disturbed water. This time, 6 figures appeared in the reflection. Cassidy, Marcus, Lexi, Jordan, Theo, Anna. Each stood motionless, eyes wide and unblinking. Their faces held no malice, no confusion, only stillness. Quinn took a step closer. The yearbook pages began to flutter, though there was no wind. The mirror pulsed once more. Then Cassidy moved. She lifted one hand and pointed at the ground in front of the mirror. Quinn understood. She stepped into the center of the chamber and knelt. Seth hesitated, then joined her. They placed their palms on the floor and waited. The carvings around them began to glow brighter. A ring of light surrounded them. The figures in the mirror began to move slowly, walking toward the glass from within. Then the chamber filled with sound. It was not speech or song, but a rising vibration like thousands of whispers stacked on top of each other. Quinn clenched her eyes shut. Her skin felt like it was stretching. Her breath caught in her throat. When she opened her eyes, everything had changed. The chamber was gone. The floor beneath her was stone but older, worn smooth by centuries. The air was heavier, full of dust and silence. The light was dim and came from no source she could find. She stood alone. Seth was no longer beside her. The mirror stood in front of her, but on this side it looked like obsidian, smooth and cold. The 6 students stood in a circle around her, alive but not quite present. They looked older than their photos, but their eyes were unchanged, still full of questions, still asking to be understood. Cassidy stepped forward. She did not speak, but Quinn heard her voice inside her own mind. It was soft, like a memory being replayed. Cassidy explained what had happened. The ritual had been performed before, long ago by others who had found the mirrors. The chamber had been buried under the chapel, part of an old order that believed reflection could be a path to truth. But the mirrors were not passive. They responded to thought, to fear, to memory. When the 6 had performed the ritual, they did not expect the pull. They had intended only to glimpse something beyond. But the mirrors had chosen. One was sent back. The rest remained, trapped in a world shaped by their fears and memories, a place not made to be lived in, a place that shifted constantly, a place that erased time. Quinn asked why now, why reappear? Cassidy said the mirror always opens again, it waits for another, not to replace, but to release. One returns, one remains. The balance must hold. Quinn realized the truth. Elijah or Elias or whatever had taken that form was never meant to leave. But something had gone wrong. The return had not closed the path, it had left a door ajar. Now the mirror was demanding its due. A trade, 1 life for 6. Quinn stood quietly. She thought of her mother, of the missing photo in her attic, of the bracelet tucked in her pocket, of the town that had buried too many secrets. She stepped forward and reached for the mirror. Cassidy shook her head. She pointed toward the 6th figure in the circle. It was Anna. Tears streamed down her face, silent and steady. Cassidy placed her hand on Quinn's shoulder. This is not your ending. It is ours. Before Quinn could speak again, a rush of wind pushed through the chamber. Light filled the space bright and blinding. The ground trembled. The figures stepped backward. The mirror pulsed one final time. Then the world fractured. When Quinn opened her eyes, she was lying on the stage of the auditorium. The trapdoor was sealed shut. Seth knelt beside her, his face pale with shock. Around them stood 6 others, disoriented, breathing hard, alive: Cassidy, Marcus, Lexi, Jordan, Theo, Anna. They looked older than their last school photos, but real. Whole. Quinn sat up. She turned to Seth and saw the question in his eyes. She shook her head. There had been a cost. One remained behind. Anna had chosen to stay, a trade freely made. In the weeks that followed, the school remained closed. The mirror chamber was never found again. The room beneath the stage was sealed by the construction crews. Principal Harland retired quietly. The 6 students were reunited with families who had long stopped hoping. They spoke little of where they had been, only that it had not been a dream. Quinn graduated with little fanfare. Seth left town. The yearbook was never recovered. Some say it vanished on its own. Others say Quinn buried it again. No one asked. The town of Brookhaven moved forward, but something stayed in the silence. A lesson. Not all reflections are meant to be seen. Not all doors are meant to be opened. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like and subscribe for more mysterious tales. Let us know in the comments what you think about the ending and where in the world you're watching from. Your thoughts help keep the mystery alive.